So this is the second in our series of webinars looking at Scope 3 emissions. Today, we're looking specifically at how you collect Scope 3 emissions data and being transparent about the processes you're going through in order to capture that data. So really excited to have everyone join. We've got a great agenda, so I'll pass over to Nandini from the ICI to kick off and talk a little bit about what the ICI is and what they do, who they are.
Great, thank you so much, Evan. Welcome everyone to the Initiative Climat International, or the International Climate Initiatives and Baringa partners led webinar series on decarbonizing Scope 3 emissions. This really is a four-part webinar series. We kicked one off last week, and this is the second of the series on Scope 3 data collection and transparency, really geared towards portfolio companies. I'm Nandini Hampel from Brugal Investments, co-lead with Thomas Carlier on the slide at Invest Industrial of the ICI-led Scope 3 Decarbonisation Working Group. We have our fantastic working group members here on the right-hand side, without which this series and Baringa's help would not have been possible. So worked in collaboration with several of these private market firms. The experts at Baringa partners, sorry to make you flip back, Evan, will lead us through the discussion today alongside a few case studies from private equity-backed businesses and firms. So just again, very quickly, ICI is a global practitioner-led community of private markets firms and investors that seek to really better understand and manage the risks associated with climate change. We're really 236 plus members to date, representing a combined $3 trillion in AUM. And the ICI Scope 3 Decarbonisation Working Group is just one of many working groups, again, as you see here, with over a dozen private markets firms, but in close collaboration as well with PRI and Ceres. Right, and so our goal is to develop practical tools for our teams and portfolio companies to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, and that's really the thesis of the webinar series. And over to Baringa partners to lead us through the discussion today.
Thanks, Nandini. As Nandini mentioned, this is the second of a four-part series of webinars. The next one is going to be on the 8th of June around setting Scope 3 targets. And then the fourth one is on the 29th of June. So do mark those in your diaries and watch out for the invites if you haven't got one already. We will be sending reminders out if you need them. Next slide, please. So my name is Simon Abrams. I'm a director at Baringa Partners. I lead our private markets ESG practice. Baringa is one of the most trusted consulting firms in the world, management consulting firms in the world. We've got 2,000 plus professionals. We're a global business. We've got over 120 market-facing partners. And in addition to focusing on climate and sustainability, where we've got a deep heritage over many, many years, we also work in across mainstream management consultancy around change management, transformation, and we work across a whole range of sectors, including government, supply chain, FMCG. We've got a lot of work in energy, but today, we're focusing on our climate and sustainability expertise, and it is the climate and sustainability team who are leading you through. So with that, I'll hand over to Evan.
Everyone, thanks so much for joining. So just as a bit of an agenda for today, we're going to do a quick recap of some of the key messages or some of the areas that we covered in the last webinar. We'll then go into bit of detail about how you go about actually collecting Scope 3 data. And then we'll get into the real meat of today's webinar, which is learning from three fantastic companies that have gone through this process and give you some hard-earned tips from their experience and what they've done. Finally, we'll wrap up with a Q&A. So please, as we go through the webinar, you'll see there's a Q&A functionality. Please type in your questions. And then we'll go through your questions at the end. Thanks so much, and let's go into the next slide. So just one more. So just as a bit of a recap, to talk a little bit about what Scope 3 emissions actually are. So we're talking about Scope 3 emissions. We're talking about all of the indirect emissions that come from your business. So these are opposed to sort of the direct operational emissions. We're talking about the upstream emissions that come from the production process and the downstream emissions that come from use and disposal of the products that you produce. Scope 3 emissions are really important because they typically represent the vast majority of your overall emissions. On our webinar last week, Guala Closures shared that their Scope 3 emissions represented 95% of their total emissions. On average, most companies see about 80% of their emissions come from Scope 3. So it's really important that this is an area that we start to address. We found that lots of companies have a really good handle about what their Scope 1 and 2 emissions are. They know the emissions that they're producing as a business. When it starts going into their value stream emissions, that's where we, as all companies, need to start developing more skills and techniques in order to start to quantify and measure the impact that we're having. So Scope 3 emissions are divided up into 15 different categories, 8 upstream categories and 7 downstream categories. By breaking it up into this way, it makes it a lot easier for companies to think about which types of Scope 3 emissions are the most relevant and important for their businesses. So for a company that's focused primarily on services, you might see business travel and employee commuting as the only real material Scope 3 emissions. But for companies that are actually producing products, all of a sudden Scope 3 emissions become a lot more important. You start looking at sort of your purchased goods and services, how the products you're producing are being used, and that's why we see so many emissions coming from Scope 3. We've got 3 companies that'll then go through how that's impacted them and what they've done about these different emissions. Going on to the next slide, just briefly, we touched on these different areas in our last webinar, but we just thought it would be useful to go through the 5 core steps that go into calculating Scope 3 emissions. The first step being around choosing your reporting boundary. So this is setting out, understanding the organizational structure of your business, looking at your subsidiaries, various entities, to try to draw the box around what emissions you'd want to include when you start to calculate them. The next step is about identifying the sources of emissions. This is about finding the most material Scope 3 emissions. We've got a slide later in the deck where we'll go through some of the key steps and screening processes that you'll look to use in order to find the emissions that you can really focus on, where you as a business will have the most control and influence. Once you've identified which emissions you're going to look at, you then start to go into collecting that data. There are 2 types of data that we'll discuss today, primary data and secondary data. Your primary data is the information and the emissions that come directly from your value chain, the emissions that you know your business is generating. And secondary emissions are the ones that are calculated using industry averages or proxies. After you've collected your emissions, you then go into selecting an emissions factor. An emissions factor lets you take that activity level data and convert it into GHG equivalents, so you can understand how much carbon your activities are actually putting into the atmosphere. And the final step is calculating the emissions themselves. So that's a very high-level overview of what you go through. 5 steps sounds very easy, but in actuality, there's a lot that goes into this, and you'll see as we start to go through the nuances, how involved it is to finally calculate your emissions. So I will pass over to Jade to start going through calculating how we're going to collect source data.
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, so the GHG Protocol have developed a process to support the calculation of Scope 3 emissions, and also to support the collection of that data. So this is particularly challenging because this is external data. It's related to other organizations, and your Scope 3 emissions come from many parts of the value chain. So this process they've put together is around prioritize, select, collect, and improve. That first step is prioritization. And that is where activities should be prioritized based on a number of criteria. And that's things like the GHG emissions impact, the financial spend on purchased products, or the magnitude of revenue, which I'll talk to in a little bit more detail in the next slide. After that prioritization exercise, you'll be in a pretty good position to select data. That will be based on data availability, the quality of data available, and also the business goals. The business goals here are quite key to this. So for example, if you're looking to do a minimum kind of reporting requirement versus building out a more intricate and accurate scope 3 calculation so reductions can be targeted. Emissions data should then be collected from suppliers and value chain partners. And if that isn't available, then secondary data can be collected, like Evan mentioned as well, from other sources, such as emissions factor databases. Over time, this data should ideally increase in quality as more businesses along the value chain collect more granular data for their own operations. And as this happens, companies should replace that previously used lower quality data with higher quality, more specific data, and it should be considered a bit of an iterative process. So if we do deep dive into that first step of that prioritization process, just on the next slide, that this step is pretty crucial because it helps you narrow down your focus, given those scope 3 emissions can come from so many different places along your business operations. So one of the biggest determinants of this prioritization is the size or the magnitude of emissions. So for example, if an organization purchases a large volume of feedstock for their processes, or have a core part of their operations where they manufacture products and sell these, the majority of the emissions may come from these areas. Another part is influence along the value chain. So just using the example before, you may have more influence over suppliers in certain areas of your business compared to other areas of your business. Corporate risk will also probably play a factor. If you have kind of climate change related risk in certain areas of the value chain. And also spend and revenue can also be a big determinant of priority. So key areas of spend and revenue should be covered for your scope 3 emissions. The other areas to consider are things like your stakeholders, where you outsource, and also if there's any specific sector guidance. And then once you've prioritized these areas, then you need to go and collect that data. Which will, I think that's on the next slide. Awesome. So yeah, Evan touched on this earlier on. So this data is split into two main categories, like we said, your primary data and your secondary data. So yeah, primary data is normally specific to your value chain. So this will be data from your suppliers or other counterparties along the value chain. When this isn't easily accessible, you can then go to secondary data. And this may be industry average data. It could be information from an organization's financials, and also it could be proxy data, where you use proxy from your own value chain to apply proxies to other products, which you are, say, purchasing or selling, which we'll talk to in a little bit more detail later on. But yeah, across both of these sets of data, the quality can vary quite substantially. And you should always aim to get the highest quality data. So the GHG Protocol have actually developed a set of data quality indicators to really help determine which data sources are best for the need. Which I think there's 5 of these. The first of those is the technology profile. So that's the degree to which the data set actually reflects the technology used. The second is the timeliness. So that's the temporal representation of that data. So does it represent the same year that your activity was in, or is it, say, an emissions factor which is 10 years old? Geography is also a key determinant of data quality. So is the data which you can source, is it from the same region, the same country, the same area? And then completeness is the next one. So that's how complete is the data set. So does it cover all relevant sites over a reasonable time period? Are there gaps in the data? Just a kind of a view of that. And then reliability is the final one. So that's really dependent on the data collection method and verification procedure. So, for example, is it verified based on data measurements, or is this data that's been generated based on assumptions by industry experts? Each one of these indicators has a scoring mechanism, which goes from very good all the way down to poor, and the GHG protocol outlines the guidance on determining those indicators in a bit more detail. The GHG protocol has that guidance. So I'll hand over to Jamie just to talk to data collection and improvement phases.
Thanks, Jade. So yeah, there's a spectrum of primary data. It has varying degrees of precision that can be obtained from suppliers and value chain partners for each product or service. In an ideal world, all data companies would be collecting would be product or service specific. However, the reality is data isn't always available at this level. Therefore, to avoid perfect becoming the enemy of the goods, companies should use other, less specific options with the intention that this moves towards a more precise primary data over time. So these alternatives, they range from sourcing activity level data. So this is data from activities that are involved in producing the same or similar products or services, to the other end of the scale, which is corporate level data, which involves leveraging greenhouse gas emissions or activity data for the entire corporation, and then apportioning the revenue or sales data of your product or service to this. So the most common challenges with primary data can be broken into two main areas. You've got availability and quality. So with availability, it's often the biggest challenge facing companies in the data collection process. And it's typically due to having a large number of suppliers, some of who lack the capacity and resources for tracking the necessary data. However, it can also be caused by factors such as language barrier gaps, or even suppliers being unwilling to divulge information they perceive to be confidential. The next one is quality. So this is another very prevalent challenge, with many suppliers lacking the knowledge and experience with GHG inventories and accounting. This can result in inconsistent and inaccurate data collection amongst suppliers. This can also be exacerbated further if there's limited or no transparency over the methodologies used by the suppliers. In many cases, primary data is not available at all, and companies have to source secondary data as well. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So as this has been mentioned previously, secondary data is generic data, so it's not from specified activities. So harking back to that adage, not letting perfect get in the way of goods, companies can utilize this data to fill gaps in the primary data. So when leveraging secondary data, companies need to ensure this is coming from reputable sources, as this will enhance the reliability and comparability of that data. They should be prioritizing the use of internationally recognized databases and publications that are either provided by national governments or otherwise peer-reviewed. The GHG Protocol also provides a list of available third-party databases that they recommend on their website, and we've attached a link to this in the appendix of the slides that will follow this presentation. So companies should use the data quality indicators that Jade has previously outlined to evaluate these secondary providers and also make more informed decisions. Selecting data sources that are the most representative in terms of the time and geography factors that Jade's previously mentioned. So, for example, this is like using an emissions factor that largely predates the data will skew the results if that has been updated since. And also you'll get more precision from analysing facilities data from the same country, as it will have a typically more similar emissions profile. Next, there's the concept of proxies. So these can be very important to companies at this stage in plugging gaps where data is particularly patchy. And these are basically data from similar activities that can be made more representative through scaling, customizing, or extrapolating. So for example, company collects data for 80% of its production, but 20% of it's unknown. It could then assume that the unknown 20% has similar characteristics to the known 80% and apply a linear extrapolation to estimate 100% of the production data. Next slide, please. So initially, companies may need to use the data that's of relatively low quality due to lack of data availability. However, over time, they should seek to improve the quality of the data of their inventory by replacing lower quality data with that of higher quality data. So the focus here should be improving on the data quality of activities that have either relatively low data quality or relatively high emissions. So with this, there are a number of controllable and uncontrollable inputs that will influence this improvement in data quality, but also improvements on how the emissions data is reported, and will have to be considered in relation to these two aforementioned focus areas, so low data quality and high emissions. The controllable inputs are largely a byproduct of the uncontrollable, and there's a cyclical relationship between all three boxes on this slide. If we delve quickly into the controllable, these inputs include changes to business activities. So as business models and structures change, so do the sources, materiality, and relevance of greenhouse gas emissions across the organisation. This requires constant maintenance and revision. This could be anything from adding a product or service that changes your company's Scope 3 emissions makeup to entering a new market with heightened regulatory requirements. Next up, you've got strategic objectives. So these are likely to shift over time as targets are set and the business is required to respond in order to meet these. Data collection and reporting systems will typically evolve based on the previous two inputs, but could also be influenced by the uncontrollable inputs, such as upcoming regulation requiring emissions reporting to adhere to a certain format. Moving on to the uncontrolled inputs, these include client requests. So these are driven by the client's own unique sustainability agendas that your company as either a provider or supplier will have to incorporate in order to keep doing business with each of these clients. Regulations and standards, they're currently at a nascent stage, and they're likely, well, they are definitely going to evolve over time. And it's essential that these factor into your business models as the requirements will become more and more stringent, and there will be financial and reputational penalties for lack of adherence. Data quality and accessibility is improving more and more as companies are being required to report on their emissions under a variety of regulations, such as TCFD in the UK or the upcoming CSRD in Europe. It's also being spurred on by the commercial opportunities available to companies who can report on their emissions. So I'll hand you back to Jade. We'll talk you through some of the data tooling.
Awesome, thanks, Jamie. So yeah, just finally on the data collection element, appreciate there's quite a lot there, lots of different sources of data. So luckily there's tools and providers in the market that can support in the collection of data, as well as the calculation of your emissions too. So on the data collection side, primary data can be collected from companies from their public disclosures, their public reports, and also supplier questionnaires can be prepared and sent to value chain partners where this data isn't available publicly to understand the GHG emissions across their supply chains. And there's private providers who can support these data collection activities as well. There's also lots of libraries of emissions factors available, which can be used to estimate emissions across the supply chain. Jamie talked to some of those a minute ago, but these are public sources, for example, government databases where they have maybe collected lots of scientific research papers and put these into a nice coherent place, which is a bit easier to access. We mentioned the GHG Protocol has a great list of sources as well. And there's also a number of private sector-specific databases. They normally have a subscription model and are widely accepted by the industries as good sources. There's also company-level data providers as well, like Bloomberg, and they have a database of reports for emissions available across multiple years, and they can also estimate company emissions as well based on the industry and their financials. So once your source data and emissions factors have been collected and selected, it's time to calculate those emissions. So there's a variety of solution providers that support Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 calculations. The GHG Protocol has its own Scope 3 evaluator tool. There are companies that support private footprinting as well. And also it's possible to build your own internal solutions, which will enable the kind of collection of data from across an organization to centralize that calculations process. So depending on your ambition and business goals, there's different options available to target different methodologies of calculating those emissions. So hopefully these tools are helpful in this process to try and simplify it down a bit. So the next thing, we're going to talk to some of the case studies. So I'll hand over to Virginia to lead us off.
Hi, everyone. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer of EV Cargo, which is in the sector of logistics. We are a leading global logistics and technology for logistics company. We are the private logistics company in the UK. And in the UK, we operate close to 500 trucks, deliver 4PL, which stands for four-party logistics services. And we also own an express hub network called Pallet Force in the UK. Our headquarters is in the UK, but we have many offices in Europe, Asia, and that's why we have a global footprint. We have around 3,000 employees. We have offices, 86 offices in 25 countries around the world. And in other countries where we don't have direct investment, we have partners, so we cover globally the whole world. Today, I'm going to explain how we calculated the Scope 3 emissions, and which account for around 91% of our total emissions. The reason why we were so keen in calculating Scope 3 was because already most of our competitors and the largest logistics company were starting to calculate the Scope 3. Also, because we signed up for the Science Based Target Initiative in September 21, and we are currently in the process of reviewing the targets. By next month, we think we are going to get them approved. So it's also a requirement under the SBTi to have a very clear inventory of what Scope 3 emissions are and set clear targets on how to reduce emissions. So our target under the SBTi is to have a reduction of Scope 3 emissions of 25% by 2030. We are going to try to get more ambitious emissions reductions, but at least this is what we are targeting under our SBTi commitment. And also a lot of our clients that are also signatory of the Science-Based Target Initiative start to check and demand this type of information. What are the emissions of the cargo movements that you have conducted for us? What are the Scope 3 emissions? So we issue reports to them according to the specific business and cargo movements that we've done for them. So this is the emissions of our Scope 3, as you can see in the percentage of what's the materiality for us. So most of our emissions are under category 4, which is the transportation and distribution, the movement of cargo that we do with other companies. So this doesn't include, of course, the Scope 1 emissions, which is where we own trucks, or Scope 2, where we have warehousing. This is just the cargo movements that we conduct with third party, other people's airlines, ships, trains, or vessels, or trucks. We also have calculated the purchased goods and services, and in this category, as you can see, is a very small percentage of our Scope 2 emissions. Capital goods, where we have included our trailers, trucks, forklifts, the emissions from the manufacturing of these capital goods. We also have calculated the fuel and energy related activities of the production and transportation of the fuel that we actually burn in our scope 1 emissions. So these are the indirect emissions of just transporting the fuel to our trucks and tanks. And we also calculated business travel, but it was not significant enough to reach even 1%. We calculated employees commuting with a tool that is available online. It's called Quantis, and it generates a certain amount of CO2 emissions based on the number of employees you have. This is for for a company that has between 2,500 employees and 5,000 employees. The tool provides you the amount of CO2 emissions. It's a general tool, and as you see, it's not primary data, but we just use this to see how material it was, this category for us, as if we had to calculate manually the emissions generated by commuting of 3,000 employees in so many different countries and offices. It would take a lot of effort of technical staff. And downstream emissions, we had 15 investments in category 15, but that also didn't reach even 1% of our emissions. So basically, upstream emissions are the categories that are more significant to us in scope 3. Next slide, please. Yes. The important for us, how we managed to calculate category 4, which was for 86% of our emissions, was because we actually use an IT tool called Ecotrans IT World, which is a tool that is accredited and compliant with the global greenhouse gas protocol. It also has a certification, the new ISO 14083, which is an ISO specific that was just issued in March this year, that is specific for calculation of greenhouse gas emissions for the logistics sector. And it also follows a methodology of the Logistics Emission Council, which is called the GHG framework, has an extensive methodology on how this the emissions for our sector should be calculated. So basically, the tool allows you to calculate in very short amount of time millions and millions of movement of cargo with different points, with different modes of transport. Also, provided that you have 4 data points, which is the point of origination of where you are collecting the cargo, the destination point, the weight of the cargo, and the mode of transport, if it's by air or ship or road or any other mode of transport, then the tool calculates the emissions and has a lot of information in there already provided. And it gives you not only the CO2 emissions, but also all the other air pollutants that are also very relevant for our sector. And what is the biggest scope 3 challenge? Well, for us has been the recent acquisitions that our company, EV Cargo, is formed by several buyouts of logistic companies, and our parent is a private equity firm named Emergevest. So every year, Emergevest keep acquiring 2 or 3 companies, and we join EV Cargo. So the fact that every year we have to add 2 or 3 big, large companies into the calculations of our scope 1, 2, and 3, and also adapt their databases and do prepare the data on how to use the tool and other of the categories, creates a very complex exercise. So for some of the categories, 1, 2, 3, we've been using Excel, and that also has been quite time consuming because of the largeness of our organization and the several offices and countries. So that has required as well a lot of appropriate training for the finance division that help us collect all this data, to several of the managers in our organization that have to use the tool and data collection. So having said that, I'm going to move to the next speaker that presents the next case study.
Thanks, Virginia. That's really interesting, particularly from my perspective. I feel humbled by the work that you've put into that. So hi, everyone. I'm Claire Clark. I'm the head of sustainability for CH&Co. We're a catering organisation, and we operate across the UK and Ireland. So we have about 1,000 different sites that we cater for. That's everything from state schools through to Buckingham Palace. We have about 10,000 employees. And we're part of Equistone's portfolio of companies. So I'll just talk you through a bit of our sort of scope 3 journey, if you like. So I've been with CH&Co for 1.5 years, and this was something that was really important to me when I joined the company. I can't express how important it is to measure scope 3 emissions, particularly as a food company. If I look at our peers in the industry, scope 3 emissions generally represent between 95 and 99% of the emissions of most food companies. And as you can see from this slide, very much we're following that trend at 99.66% of our emissions sitting in our scope 3. The reasons why it was really important for us to take this journey around our scope 3, well, for us, it was demand from our clients. In every tender that we go for, there's a question about our net zero strategy and how legitimate that is. It very much helps us to remain competitive. So if you look at our industry peers, both other caterers and other food businesses, they're all on this net zero journey. And for me, like something that really helped me to get that board level buy-in was like part of our key growth strategy is around doing the right thing. So sustainability really being an important part of that. As I sort of mentioned, in particularly in my industry, there's a lot of greenwashing that happens. So making sure that we were really legitimate in our approach to our scope 3 and our net zero strategy was really important. So setting science-based targets was really important to us so that we avoid any reputational risk if what we're doing wasn't meeting those really high requirements. And it also just means that any scope 3 regulation, you know, we're very much prepared for that at hopefully the highest level. So in my humbleness to Virginia here, my track was to say it's really not that easy. It's hugely time consuming and get help from experts. So you know, I really recognized the scale of what we were trying to do. So we worked to find a partner to work with us on our scope 3. So we worked with some really experienced consultants that had lots of experience in food and manufacturing. That was really important because at the time we embarked on this journey, there was very little, there wasn't a greenhouse gas sort of protocol around food, and that's since come out. But when we started this journey, that didn't exist. So that was it was important that we had some expertise that could learn from how other companies had taken these first steps. We also worked with RAP, who are an NGO operating across the UK, and they were at the time working to create this consistent methodology for businesses to measure and track supply chain emissions. And so we worked with them and lots of other food businesses to agree upon which emission factors should be used in the food industry. So lots of the sort of supermarkets and other big food businesses were also taking part in that pilot study. And one thing I will say, if anyone is looking to work with consultants on this, something that I know our consultants found really helpful was actually like getting them into our business to really understand how we work. Contract catering is a bit of an odd world. So it was just really useful for them. We took them around to quite a few different sites so they could see the the scale and breadth of how we operate and really understand where those emissions might lie and how they should be accounted for. And so, yeah, collecting the data, I think, it's been mentioned a couple of times, but recognizing that no data is perfect, but you've got to start somewhere. We very much sort of started in a position where we, we're dealing with very large data sets. So for our purchase goods and services, we have 68,000 product lines just on food. So tackling that in a way that meant that data was usable and not based on values when you have huge issues around food price inflation was really important. So assigning to 68,000 product lines a specific weight was quite a big task that we had to take on. I've got lots of information on various weights of small and large pineapples. If that's useful to anyone, I'm happy to share. So we were very much recognizing where we had data, where we didn't have data, and where we could use data that maybe wasn't traditionally sustainability data, but manipulate that in a way that we could make assumptions. We have very good financial data, I think most companies do. So in a lot of cases, we were manipulating financial data to get that baseline in place. Now we're very much working to improve that data. We spent a lot of time speaking to our suppliers to see which levels of primary data they were able to share. We had some really great data coming through from, say, our logistics company, our main logistics company, I should say. We're able to provide some absolutely fantastic data, similar to exactly what Virginia was speaking about earlier. But equally, a lot of our suppliers are SMEs, so not only do they lack any kind of capacity, they definitely don't have sustainability managers, but they just haven't been tasked with collecting this kind of data before. I think earlier it was mentioned around language barriers. We have global food supply chains. Confidentiality has been a challenge for us. Particular suppliers really feeling that we would be using that data for commercial gain, which 100% we are not. So that's been a journey for us and continues to be, but we've making huge headway on that. And then, so once we've sort of collected all of our data, and this is sort of the outcome of that. So you can see here that purchase goods and services is by far and away our largest impact area within our scope 3. That's really normal for a food company, and that will evolve as the data improves as well. We held, so once we got together our baseline here, we then held stakeholder workshops. So for us, this was our food development teams, our facilities management teams, our people teams, and our procurement teams. To help, so they sort of took ownership of what we were building as our reduction roadmap and setting those targets. I think it's really important as well to recognize, I know this is about scope 3, but our board really recognized that we have to tackle our scope 1 and 2, yes, for science-based targets, but as a company, we have to be shown that the things that are very much within our control, we are going to take action on and hopefully lead by example for those people that sit within our value chain. So for us, it is really important that we tackle our scope 1 and 2 with that same sort of vigor that we're trying to influence our scope 3 as well. Doing those stakeholder workshops really helped us realize and understand sort of what was realistic for delivery. Particularly, I think our food development teams were really able to say, actually different cooking techniques and different equipment that, we were suggesting might be used to decarbonize actually wouldn't be functional for creating great tasting food, because that's ultimately what we're all about. So having that engagement and I think getting that buy-in at that early stage and setting those targets was really, really important for us. So then once we've got our baseline and we've kind of got our reduction roadmap, this was all, I took all this to our board to get sign off on this. And then we've just submitted our science-based targets back in March this year, which was very much handled by the consultants that we use. So feel very, as I say, humbled by Virginia doing all of that herself, but we worked with you know, some absolute experts to get those submitted on time for the March deadline for food companies that weren't wanting to submit for FLAG. Next steps for us, so setting our reduction activity in motion. We've got our reduction roadmap, so making that happen is what we're on at the moment. Sharing this baseline data, so you know, sharing with you guys, but equally our annual report will be due out in July, so this will have all of our baseline information in there. A lot of our focus now is on improving our data and engaging our supply chain. So we're actually recruiting a couple of roles to support with that at the moment. And then for us, FLAG emissions that I mentioned, we will have to resubmit our science-based targets in the next couple of years to include those agricultural, the land change use of food supply chains. So that's the next piece that we'll be working on. And you know, just making sure that we're creating this culture of change around the key activity, you know, communicating our goals both internally and then working with partners to share our story, but also we're working with a couple of I'd say like sort of innovative startup companies to see how we can improve this kind of data sharing and piece for the rest of the industry, because you know, food supply chains is made up of lots of SMEs, and there's you know, in some cases a lot that needs to happen, and to help that kind of shimmy along, we're trying to look at solutions to that. So that's me, and I'm going to hand over to Nicola for the next session.
Thank you for handing it over. So I'd suggest to go on the next slide. So I was wondering, probably that most of you would think now, you know, how to start tackling this. So I would like to give you kind of a perspective on SME, on their journey. So my name is Nicola Thijs. I work for Bregal Investments, and I lead the ESG work mostly in our European fund. So this is a manufacturing company in one of our funds. It's an SME, so really below 200 employees, and what they do is they're a manufacturer of trenchless pipe rehabilitation technologies, so really part of the construction industry and value chain. So it's quite heavy on material for those pipes. And as you can see on the left side, right, their scope 3 categories is mainly made up of purchased goods and services. So it's a typical wastewater or water pipe made out of resin and glass fiber. So those are two big heavy hitters in terms of CO2, while the rest is a bit less material in terms of overall volume. So the company has set SBTi targets for scope 1 and 2, but obviously for their scope 3 emissions, as they're a fast-growing company, they don't have targets yet. But they started that journey of already starting to monitor it and want to be in a position to be able to influence scope 3 the moment they will grow and not be an SME anymore down the road, and will need to set targets on scope 3. So that's one of their motivation. And the other one is obviously also customers, being part of the construction industry, and obviously talking about pipe rehabilitation. A lot of their customers are even either government-led or semi-government-led utilities or municipalities that also have their own sustainability ambitions and would like to get information on the carbon footprint. So next slide, please. So what you can see here is that they started off measuring their carbon footprint really pragmatically and taking a proxy-based approach. So the amount of material total they use per revenue, right? So they multiply that by their revenue, and then came up with a footprint, and that was especially relevant for the resin and the glass fiber. But then the year after, they tried to become more and more precise and improve the data quality and move to more activity-based. So the amount of tons they actually purchased in terms of resin and glass fiber. But for some, they even went and started discussing it with suppliers. So they had supplier-based data. So for some suppliers of glass fiber and resin, they could even provide a footprint themselves, which was obviously impacting then the emission factor. So meaning per tons of resin purchased, it wasn't the global average factor of emissions per ton, but the supplier specific factor. So all in all, this helped them actually move or reduce even their carbon footprint slightly. So by 1,000 compared to their 42,000 tons. And they already took some initiatives to reduce their spend on purchased goods and services through different initiatives. But you can see the company is still growing, right? The increased activity implies that the company is growing. So even in a growing environment, they achieved the reduction. Next slide. And I think for me, the key takeaway, right, is not necessarily that company in itself, but it's more of a message on how do you start that journey and how do you move up the journey of data quality and what advantages does that bring? Obviously, when you start, be pragmatic, right? Your first effort, try to get the data that you already have. And oftentimes it will be proxy based or even spend based. That is already good. So you'll be in the D or the C range in the kind of quality of data. But obviously that will be quite a low effort. So you'll get a good first results first. But that data will obviously be limited in terms of what you can do with that data, how you can analyze it. And oftentimes you'll have also higher emissions because of these industry average emission factors that you'll use in your first calculation, right? So that's also how our company started their journey. And now they're almost at supplier-based scope, at least for the resin and for the glass fiber, meaning that they have high quality of data transparency. They know exactly, how much of the resin is bought from a more carbon intensive or less carbon intensive supplier. They know exactly what measures they could take to reduce or reduce their footprint and make it in line with the supply chain strategy. And all in all, it often leads to a lower carbon footprint intrinsically when you move up the data quality. But obviously, the higher data quality also means a higher effort because you need to have a higher higher data, granularity, but also have some discussions with your supplier, right? So I think that's also something that is to take into account, but also there is ways to mitigate that higher effort. So for me, the key takeaways are that start early, right, and start simply with secondary data, but be aware that, or have an ambition to move year over year towards more higher quality data and primary data. Systemize the carbon capture along the supply chain. So make sure to integrate this with your supply chain department. Make sure that your supply chain department gets also a basic education on what even is greenhouse gas protocol, what are scope 3, what are the different categories, how to talk to suppliers about this. And when you talk to supplier about it, make sure that you also make sure to understand where they are in their journey, right? Some suppliers might already have public reports about it. So in those public reports, you might already find a lot of information, and that might signify that they're quite advanced in their journey. But some others haven't even started thinking about it. So make sure to take into account for each supplier where they are on their journey. And it's also fine if they start in their carbon assessment and making a first and pushing or asking for one supplier to do a first carbon assessment is already great victory before even discussing with them reduction levers, right? But I think the neat thing about it is once you move towards that supplier-based assessment, you will see that more and more suppliers over the years will have their own decarbonization targets. And your company can then piggyback basically of the decarbonization efforts of your suppliers without having to actually define any concrete measures in yours, because your measures was already to discuss this with your suppliers to make sure that you appreciate their efforts, and thus you will profit from their decarbonization effort. And if they don't do this intrinsically, there's always incentive schemes to always put in place. But in my experience at this point in time, a lot of companies have already enough incentives from their other stakeholders to drive a decarbonization roadmap themselves. And I think what's also good to keep in mind is that it's a marathon, not a sprint. So if you start this year with a first assessment, that's good, right? And if you haven't talked to your suppliers yet, that's fine. That's something for the next year or for the year after, or even then, right? I think the goal is 2030 or 2040 for net zero. So there's plenty of time left, but it's about making step-by-step progress year after year. I think that's the main topic. And I think that's my key messages. And I think we open up the floor for Q&A now.
Thanks, Nicola. We're running short of time, but we did have one question that we wanted to answer, and then I think, Virginia, there was a couple of questions on the data providers. But the question that we wanted to focus on is this one. How would you define the difference of data points from category 1, purchase goods and services, versus category 2, capital goods?
Is that a question towards me?
Yeah, I think that was a question towards you. And sorry, there was one other question about spend-based analysis tools and software. So maybe we can take that one for you, Nicola, if you've got a view, and then we'll ask Jade about spend-based analysis tools and software.
Okay, so I'll take the capital goods and purchase goods. Okay, so purchased goods obviously are often a variable cost, right? So it's often to do with your cost of goods sold. So that's where in your financing department you would find the most spend on purchasing goods. And then capital goods oftentimes, right, refer to a CapEx, so not an OpEx. And I think that's a good way to start. I wouldn't worry too much about the differentiation, right? As mentioned before, it's a journey, it's a marathon. And going by CapEx and OpEx in the beginning and starting that way is fine, right? And if there is some of the purchases that are mislabeled, it doesn't matter, frankly, right? It won't change the needle as long as you have the most material purchases accounted for in either category. And as you go along the journey, you'll find out that maybe, you know, we should have moved this to here because it's different, and you'll understand better the context. But I wouldn't be afraid of that differentiation to not move forward, basically.
Thanks, Nicola. That's really helpful. And then Jade, the other question.
Yeah, so there's a question, what's your view on spend-based analysis, tool software, and how to use and apply them? So just to recap, in general, a spend-based approach looks at an average emissions per dollar spent in, say, in a certain industry or on certain products. And in general, they're based on a point-in-time calculation looking at the general cost of products versus the carbon intensity. And they might change over time based on things like inflation or if there's a kind of really big shift. So if we think about the data quality indicators mentioned before, they're generally not geographically specific, and they often don't vary year to year either. So in general, they have lower temporal resolution and a lower geographical resolution. But they are really good to do that first level prioritization. So if you have lots of different spend and you want to just see where your big hotspots are, I think they're really useful for those. It's also, in my view, quite useful for the other lower priority items. So where you don't want to go on a big data collection exercise, kind of defaulting to a spend-based approach is a good way to try and keep that coverage high without having to go into detail on all of your emissions. And I think there was also a question just on tooling for Virginia on the name of a tool used to calculate employee commuting. So yeah, if you could just remind.
The one we used was Quantis, and is the tool that is part of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It's available online for free, and it's very easy to use. You just put the number of employees and it gives you the gross CO2 emissions. Quantis.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for that good plug for Quantis and for sharing sort of your experience and for everyone going through sort of what you've done with Scope 3 emissions. As we mentioned at the beginning, we'll send out a recording to this as well as the slides, so you'll have those, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone next week when we'll go through our next webinar, which focuses on Scope 3 emission reduction targets. So from us at Baringa and the ICI, thanks everyone for joining.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Thanks. Bye.